He should have been screaming. Every species we had ever conquered screamed when they were dragged through the corridors of a Valanthi warship. The Draenei wailed. The Korvathi begged. The Silthari collapsed and had to be carried. But this creature, this human, walked upright between my guards with his wrists bound behind his back, his boots striking the metal floor in a steady rhythm, and he said nothing. Not one word, not one sound. I am Kalith Sorvon, eldest daughter of Empress Valith, heir to the Valanthi Dominion, and I had just led my first military operation against a human frontier outpost. The raid was supposed to last 40 minutes. It lasted 9 hours. We lost 2 cruisers, a gunship, and 400 warriors taking a single station that held fewer than 80 defenders. 80, against the most powerful military force in the known galaxy. And now, I was walking one of those defenders through my ship like a trophy, because that was exactly what he was supposed to be. Commander Declan Voss. That was the name stitched into the torn fabric on his chest. I had pulled his identification from the wreckage of his command post, a room he had defended until the ceiling collapsed on top of him. My soldiers found him pinned under a fallen beam, still firing his weapon with one free hand. The corridors of the Throne of Ashes were lined with trophies from every civilization the Dominion had consumed over 9,000 years. Crystal sculptures from Deneth, woven banners from the Korvathi temples, fossilized instruments from the Silthari concert halls. I walked him past every single one, slowly, deliberately. I wanted him to see the scale of what he was dealing with. I wanted him to understand that his species was next. He looked at each trophy as we passed. But his face did not show fear. It did not show awe. It showed something I could not name, something I had never seen on the face of a prisoner. His brow pulled together, his jaw tightened, his eyes lingered on the Korvathi banners and the Silthari instruments, with an expression that sat somewhere between sadness and anger. He looked at the remnants of dead civilizations, and he pitied them, not himself, them. It made my skin glow a sharp, irritated violet. I threw him into a holding cell on the detention level. The cell was built for Draenei prisoners, creatures that stood nearly 3 meters tall, so the human looked small inside it. Good. I wanted him to feel small. I gave him 2 hours, then I returned for interrogation. Standard Valanthi interrogation doctrine followed a simple progression. Intimidation first, then pain, then chemical extraction. I had been trained in all 3 methods since I was old enough to hold a blade. I sat across from the containment barrier and activated the recording system and prepared to begin. He was sitting on the floor with his legs crossed, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even. He did not look up when I entered. I told him he would answer my questions about human military deployments along the border sectors. I told him I would be fair if he cooperated and thorough if he did not. I told him he was the property of the Valanthi Dominion now. He opened his eyes and looked at me. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds on a methane world, and there was something behind them that I could not crack open. He asked me a question instead. He said, "How many of these species, whose trophies line your corridors, are still alive?" I told him that was not how interrogation worked. He was supposed to answer, not ask. He waited. Something in his silence made me answer. I told him all conquered species were integrated into the Dominion as functional castes. None of them had resisted integration. He nodded slowly and said that integration and extinction looked the same from the inside. I terminated the session. I went to my quarters and told myself it did not matter what one prisoner thought. The Dominion had ruled 43 species across 600 star systems for 9,000 years. One human's opinion was less than nothing, but the words stayed in my head like a splinter under the skin, and I could not pull them out. I reviewed the battle footage from the raid instead. I had watched combat recordings 1,000 times before, studying tactics, analyzing enemy weaknesses, looking for patterns I could exploit. I expected the human footage to show me a disorganized, primitive force fighting from instinct. What I saw made me replay the footage 3 times. The humans fought in coordinated groups. shifting formation in real time without visible communication. They anticipated our flanking maneuvers before we executed them. When their outer perimeter fell, they collapsed into a tighter defensive ring and made us pay for every corridor in bodies. When the station's reactor began to destabilize, 3 human soldiers stayed behind to hold a junction so the others could reach the evacuation shuttles. They knew they were going to die. They held anyway. But the moment that made me stop the playback and stare at the frozen image on my screen was this. A human pilot, a woman whose fighter had already taken critical damage, turned her dying ship directly into the engine array of our cruiser Tailketh. She aimed for the weakest structural point and hit it at full acceleration. The explosion crippled the cruiser and bought enough time for a transport full of human civilians to reach the jump point. The transport's manifest, which we recovered from the wreckage, listed 46 passengers. 28 of them were children. She traded her life for 28 children she had probably never met. I sat in my quarters for a long time after that. The Valanthi language has 17 words for conquest, 17 ways to describe the act of taking, claiming, dominating. We have no word for what that pilot did. We have no word for choosing death so that someone else might live. The concept does not exist in our vocabulary, our philosophy, or our understanding of how intelligent beings behave. I went back to the detention level. He was still sitting in the same position, legs crossed, breathing steady. He opened his eyes when I approached the barrier. I asked him what the pilot's name was, the one who rammed the Tailketh. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said her name was Lieutenant Grace Holloway, and she was 26 years old, and she played the violin, and she had a younger brother back on Earth who was probably being told right now that she was not coming home. I asked him why she did it. He said because the children on that transport could not fight for themselves, so she fought for them. I asked him if all humans would do that. He said no, not all, but enough. He said humans were not perfect. They were selfish and petty and afraid sometimes, just like any species. But somewhere deep in their biology, in the wiring of their brains, was a mechanism that could override every survival instinct when someone weaker needed protection. He said it was not rational, it was not efficient, it was not something that made sense from a military standpoint. It was just human. I asked him how a species survived with an instinct like that, an instinct that told its members to die for strangers. He leaned forward and said that was exactly how they survived. He said a species where individuals would sacrifice for the group was a species that could endure anything. Famine, war, plague, extinction-level events. Humanity had faced all of those and come through every single one, not because they were the strongest, or the fastest, or the smartest, but because when the worst came, they reached for each other instead of running. The barrier hummed between us. His skin was pale and bruised and cut in a dozen places from the battle. He was smaller than me by a full head. His species could not see in the dark or heal from wounds the way we could. He should have been nothing. But I stood outside that cell and felt something I had never felt before. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. Something that told me the creature on the other side of that barrier was not a trophy, was not a prize, was not a lesser being I could parade before the court. He was something my empire had no category for. I told him we would arrive at the throne world in 3 days. I told him the Empress would decide his fate. He nodded and closed his eyes again. I walked back to my quarters, and the corridors felt different. The trophies on the walls looked different. The Korvathi banners, the Silthari instruments, the Deneth crystals. I had passed them 10,000 times and never once thought about the hands that made them. I had never wondered if those hands had reached out for help before the end. I wondered now. I locked my quarters and sat in the dark and told myself this was weakness. This was contamination. A warrior of the Valanthi Dominion did not feel doubt. Doubt was for prey. But the doubt was already inside me, and it had a voice, and it spoke in simple, quiet words that cut deeper than any blade in my armory. Integration and extinction looked the same from the inside. I did not sleep. 3 days to the throne world. 3 days with a human prisoner who refused to be afraid, who looked at my empire and saw a graveyard, who carried the name of a dead pilot in his memory like a sacred thing. 3 days. And already, the cracks were beginning to show. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself he was just a prisoner, just a creature from a primitive world, just another species that would learn its place. I was wrong about everything. The next morning, I returned to his cell with a datapad full of questions about human fleet deployments, weapons systems, and command structures. I had spent the sleepless hours rebuilding my composure. I was Caliph Sorvon, heir to an empire. I would not be unsettled by a single prisoner. Declan was standing this time, near the far wall of the cell, examining the surface with his fingertips. When I asked what he was doing, he told me he was reading the marks. I did not understand. He traced a set of scratches in the wall, faint lines gouged into the metal, and said these were made by Drenai claws, counting marks. Whoever was in this cell before him had been counting the days. He asked me how long the previous occupant had been held here. I checked the records. The cell's last occupant was a Drenai laborer accused of damaging a reactor coupling. He had been held for 11 months before being transferred to a penal colony. Declan counted the marks on the wall. Then he said the count stopped at 312. He asked me how many days were in 11 months by Valanthi reckoning. I told him 340. He looked at me and said the prisoner stopped counting with 28 days left. He asked me what I thought that meant. I knew what it meant. It meant the prisoner had given up hope. It meant he had stopped believing anyone was coming, stopped believing the days mattered, stopped believing there was a future worth counting toward. But I did not say that. I said we were not here to discuss former prisoners. I told him to sit down and answer my questions about human weapons capabilities. He sat down. He answered every question I asked, with calm, precise detail. He told me about human railgun technology, about their shield harmonics, about their fleet coordination protocols. He gave me everything, openly, without resistance. I was suspicious. No prisoner gave up intelligence this freely. He told me he was not giving me anything my people would not discover on their own within 6 months. He said the technology was not what made humans dangerous. I asked him what did. He leaned forward and said it was the fact that every single one of them had chosen to be there. Not conscripted, not bred for service, not forced by caste obligation. Every soldier in that outpost had walked into a recruitment office on their own legs, signed their own name and said, "I want to protect the people I love." He said, "Try building a weapon that can beat that." I ended the session and walked through the ship with his words echoing in my mind. I passed a group of Drenai laborers scrubbing the corridor walls. They pressed themselves flat as I walked by, eyes down, shoulders hunched. They had been doing this for 400 years. Their grandparents had done this. Their grandparents' grandparents had done this. I had never questioned it. It was the natural order. The strong ruled, the weak served. This was the founding truth of the Valanthi Dominion. But I kept hearing his voice. Every single one of them had chosen. I wondered what the Drenai would do if they were given a choice. That question was still burning in my mind when the alarms went off. The sound tore through the corridor like a living thing. Red emergency lights flooded every surface. I grabbed the communicator on my wrist and demanded a report from the bridge. The response came broken, panicked. The Drenai laborers in the lower decks had seized the engine room. They had locked the blast doors and overridden the security systems, and they were threatening to destabilize the reactor core. This was a voiceless uprising. These happened occasionally across the Dominion. Standard protocol was simple and brutal. Send in a strike team, kill the leaders, punish the survivors so severely that no one would try again for another 50 years. I had been trained for exactly this scenario. I mobilized my warriors, 60 armored Valanthi soldiers, fully armed, stacking up at the blast doors to the engine room. I was at the front. This was my ship, my command, my problem. My chief engineer sent me the damage assessment through my earpiece. The Drenai had wired the reactor's cooling system to a manual override. If we breached the blast doors, they would trigger a cascade failure. The reactor would go critical within 90 seconds. We would not be able to stop it. Everyone on the ship, all 6,000 crew members, would die. They were not bluffing. The engineering signatures confirmed the bypass was real. I stood in front of the sealed blast doors with 60 soldiers behind me and no viable way in. If I attacked, the ship died. If I waited, the situation would spread. Other voiceless laborers on other decks might join the uprising. The entire vessel could fall apart from the inside. My second-in-command suggested we vent the engine room to vacuum, kill everyone inside, including the Draenei, and then send repair crews to restore the reactor before it destabilized. I ran the numbers. The reactor would fail before the venting completed. Same result. Everyone dies. I stood there, and for the first time in my military career, I did not know what to do. And then I thought about the human. I do not know why. I do not know what instinct or what failure of training made me turn away from the blast doors and walk to the detention level. My soldiers stared at me as I left. My second-in-command called after me. I kept walking. I reached his cell. He was standing at the barrier, watching the emergency lights flash. He already knew something was wrong. I told him what was happening. Draenei laborers had taken the engine room. They had rigged the reactor. I could not breach without killing everyone aboard. He listened. Then he asked me one question. What do they want? I stared at him. No one had asked that. Not me, not my officers, not my security chief. Our entire protocol was built around one assumption. The voiceless did not get to want things. He said it again, slower. What do they want, Caliph? Have you asked? I walked back to the blast doors with Declan's question ringing in my skull. My soldiers parted around me, confused, waiting for orders. I went to the sealed communications panel beside the blast doors and opened a channel to the engine room. A voice answered, old, steady, female. Her name was Tessavri, and she spoke Valanthi with the careful precision of someone who had been forced to learn the language of her captors. She told me she represented the Draenei workers aboard this vessel, and aboard 6 other vessels in the home fleet. I asked her what she wanted. She said one thing: we want to speak to the Empress. Not freedom, not weapons, not revenge. Just an audience. Just the right to stand before the ruler of the Dominion and say, out loud, what life was like for the voiceless. The simplicity of it staggered me. 400 years of subjugation. 400 years of scrubbing corridors and hauling cargo, and dying in reactor accidents, while their culture was erased, and their language was forbidden, and their children were born into a system that called them voiceless, as if silence was the natural state of their existence, and all they wanted was permission to speak. I made a decision that no Valanthi royal had ever made. I gave Tessavri my oath, my word, as a daughter of the Empress, that the Draenei would have their audience, that their voice would be heard. My officers looked at me as if I had lost my mind. Tessavri was quiet for a long time. Then she accepted. The blast doors opened, the reactor stabilized. My soldiers moved in and took control of the engine room. The Draenei workers knelt with their hands visible, compliant, surrendering. Tessavri stood among them, tall for her species, her long face marked with age lines and old scars, and she looked at me with eyes that held 400 years of waiting. I gave orders that no one was to be harmed. My second-in-command opened his mouth to protest and closed it when he saw my face. Later that night, I went to Declan's cell. The ship was quiet again. The emergency lights had faded. The corridors were dark. I asked him why he helped me. He was my prisoner, my enemy. His people and mine were killing each other on the border right now. Why would he give me the answer that saved my ship? He looked at me with those gray eyes and said something that I will carry with me until I die. He said he did not help me. He helped the Draenei. I stood there, and the weight of it pressed down on me. This creature had been in chains for 2 days. He was wounded and captive, and facing execution. And in those 2 days, he had done more for the voiceless people on my ship than I had done in my entire life. I left his cell without another word. I went to my quarters and stood in front of the mirror. My skin was cycling through colors I could not control. Violet, gray, pale blue, deep amber. Emotions I did not have names for, churning beneath the surface. 2 days. 2 days with a human prisoner, and my ship had nearly been destroyed. My assumptions had been shattered, and I had made a promise to a Draenei elder that could end my claim to the throne. One more day until we reached the throne world. One more day until I had to stand before my mother, the Empress, and explain why I had given the voiceless a voice. I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to imagine how that conversation would go. I could see my mother's face, cold and ancient, and carved from stone. I could see the court, glittering and vicious. I could see my brother Sorath, sharpening his ambitions like blades, waiting for me to stumble. And I could see Declan, sitting cross-legged in his cell, eyes closed, breathing steady, completely unafraid of an empire that had crushed 43 civilizations. I did not sleep that night either. When the Throne of Ashes dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and Valanthos Prime filled the viewport, I stood on the bridge and looked at the throne world. The crystal cities, the orbital defense platforms, the shipyards where warships were born by the hundred, the seat of the most powerful civilization in the galaxy. It looked different now. I gave orders to prepare the prisoner for presentation at court. I requested a formal audience with the Empress, and I sent a private communication to Tessavri in the lower decks. I told her to prepare her people. They were going to speak. The docking clamps engaged, the gangways extended, the doors opened onto the throne world, and I stepped through them carrying a weight I had not carried 2 days ago. The weight of a question I could not answer. If integration and extinction looked the same from the inside, then what had my empire been building for 9,000 years? I walked into the palace, and the walls were lined with trophies, and I saw every single one of them clearly for the first time. The court of Valanthos Prime was the largest enclosed space in the known galaxy. A crystalline dome arched overhead, spanning nearly a kilometer, its facets catching the light of the Valanthi sun and splitting it into rivers of color that poured across the assembly below. 12,000 seats rose in tiered rings around a central platform, and every seat was occupied. Warriors in ceremonial armor, administrators in flowing robes, diplomats from vassal worlds, delegations from every corner of the Dominion. And at the apex, on a throne carved from the core of a dead star, sat my mother. Empress Valeth was 327 years old. She had taken the throne before humans had left their own atmosphere. She had conquered 11 species personally, overseen the subjugation of 19 more, and signed the extinction orders for 3 civilizations that refused integration. Her skin was a constant, unwavering deep gold, the color of absolute authority. I had never seen it flicker. I walked to the center platform and knelt. The court fell silent. 12,000 Valanthi watched me, and behind me, flanked by 4 guards, walked my prisoner. Declan moved through that ocean of alien stares without flinching. I had expected the scale of the court to rattle him. The dome alone dwarfed anything humans had ever built. The crowd was a wall of luminous skin and predatory eyes. He walked through it like he was crossing a room. I presented my report, the raid on the human outpost, the losses we sustained, the intelligence we gathered. I framed it as a military success, which it technically was, though the cost had been absurd. Then I presented my prize. Commander Declan Voss, a captured human officer, for the Empress to judge and dispose of as she saw fit. My mother studied him from her throne. Her golden eyes moved over him like scanners, measuring, categorizing, dismissing. She said he looked fragile. She said humans appeared to be a minor species, hardly worth the resources I had spent. Sorath was standing at the base of the throne, exactly where I expected him to be. My younger brother was everything the Dominion valued. Tall, powerful, ambitious, ruthless. His skin burned a permanent aggressive crimson, and his smile had too many teeth. He had been lobbying for the succession for decades, and he saw every mistake I made as a gift. Where I had spent my years studying strategy and fleet command, Sorath had spent his cultivating alliances among the military caste, whispering in the ears of senior commanders, building a network of loyalty that had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with favors owed and threats implied. He was dangerous not because he was strong, but because he was patient, and patience in a predator was far more frightening than speed. He stepped forward and suggested the human be sent to the proving. The court murmured approval. The proving was an ancient ritual where a captured enemy fought Valanthi champions in single combat. It was not a fair fight. It was not designed to be. It was a public demonstration of Valanthi superiority. A spectacle meant to remind the court and the vassal species, and the voiceless, that resistance was not just futile, but laughable. The arena had been soaked in the blood of 100 species. No captured prisoner had ever survived the proving. The ritual was designed to make defeat look inevitable, and mercy look like weakness. My mother agreed. The human would face the Provin. Proving at moonrise, 7 champions, sequential combat, weapons would be provided. I looked at Declan. His expression did not change. The court dispersed to prepare for the spectacle. I requested permission to secure the prisoner myself, and walked Declan down through the palace to the dungeons beneath the foundation. The dungeons of Valanthos Prime were carved into the bedrock of the planet itself, deep enough that no signal could reach them, dark enough that even Valanthi eyes strained. I dismissed the guards and stood outside his cell. I told him what the proving was. 7 Valanthi champions, each one a career warrior, each one bred and trained for combat since birth. They would be bigger than him, faster than him, stronger than him. The weapons they would give him would be inadequate. The arena would be shaped to their advantage. The entire thing was designed for one outcome. He listened. Then he asked me about the rules. I explained the structure. Single combat, one opponent at a time. If a champion fell, the next entered. Weapons provided at the start. No armor. The fight continued until the prisoner was dead or all 7 champions were defeated. He asked if there were rules about killing. I told him the champions would absolutely try to kill him. He said that was not what he asked. He asked if there was a rule that said he had to kill them. I stared at him. No one had ever asked that question about the proving. The answer was no, there was no such rule, because the premise of the Prensivry was that the prisoner would be too busy dying to worry about restraint. He nodded. Then he asked me for one thing. Not a weapon, not armor, not an escape route. He asked me to make sure Tesavri and the Drenai delegation were in the audience. I asked him why. He said, because they needed to see this. I left the dungeon and arranged it. Tesavri and her people were given seats in the upper gallery, the section reserved for voiceless observers who were occasionally permitted to watch court functions. They would be present. They would see everything. The hours passed. Moonrise approached. The arena filled. The proving arena was an open circle beneath the great dome, the floor paved with dark stone, the walls lined with ancient weapons from conquered civilizations. The Empress sat in her elevated box. Sorath stood beside her, his crimson skin pulsing with anticipation. 12,000 spectators filled the tiered seating. In the upper gallery, Tesavri and 40 Drenai workers watched in silence. I sat in the royal box below my mother's throne and gripped the arms of my seat until my knuckles ached. The gates opened. Declan walked into the arena. They had given him a short blade, barely longer than his forearm. A simple weapon, almost contemptuous in its inadequacy, compared to the war lances the champions would carry. He held it loosely, testing the weight, and rolled his shoulders. He looked small against the vast dark stone of the arena floor. The first champion entered. Kael Morath, a warrior of the 3rd caste, nearly 3 meters tall, carrying a double-bladed lance that hummed with resonance energy. He was a veteran of 30 campaigns. He had killed hundreds. Morath charged. What happened next made me stop breathing. Declan did not meet the charge head-on. He moved sideways at the last instant, a step so precise it looked choreographed, and let Morath's momentum carry the massive warrior past him. As Morath passed, Declan struck once, a single surgical cut to the tendon behind Morath's knee. The champion buckled. Declan followed, swept the lance from Morath's grip, and pressed the short blade to the warrior's throat. Then he stepped back. Morath was alive, wounded, disarmed, beaten in 4 seconds, but alive. The court went silent. The second champion entered immediately. Vestalorn, even larger than Morath, moving with a speed that belied her size. She was smarter than Morath, more cautious. She circled Declan, testing his range, probing for weaknesses. Declan let her come. He watched her feet. He watched her balance shift, her weight distribution, the tiny tells in her grip that signaled her strike pattern. When she committed to her attack, he was already somewhere else. He deflected her lance with the flat of his blade and redirected her own force into the arena wall. She hit hard, He disarmed her before she could recover. He did not deliver the killing blow. 2 champions down. The court was buzzing now, a sound like a hive disturbed. I could see the confusion spreading through the crowd. This was not how the proving was supposed to go. The 3rd and 4th champions came together, breaking protocol. They attacked in coordinated pairs, something that had never happened in a proving, because it had never been necessary. Declan fought them both simultaneously, using the arena's geometry to prevent them from flanking him, forcing them to get in each other's way. He moved between them like smoke, never where they expected, always shifting, always adapting. One of them caught him with a glancing blow across the left arm, opening a cut that bled freely down his wrist. He switched his grip, used the blood to slick the handle of one champion's lance when he deflected it, and the weapon slipped from the warrior's grasp. The other champion overcompensated, swung wide, and Declan dropped low and swept both legs out from under him. 2 more on the ground, 2 more breathing. The crowd was changing. I could feel it in the air, the way you feel a storm shifting direction. The jeering had stopped. The casual cruelty of spectators watching an execution had been replaced by something else entirely. Attention. Real, focused, uncomfortable attention. These were warriors, watching a warrior, and what they were seeing contradicted everything they believed. By the 5th champion, something had changed in the arena. The crowd was no longer jeering. They were watching, really watching. The 5th champion entered slowly, and I could see it in his posture, in the way his feet hesitated on the arena floor, in the micro-tremors running through his lance arm. Hesitation. He was afraid. A Valanthi champion, a career warrior who had killed dozens of enemies in single combat, was afraid of a human half his size, who was bleeding from 3 wounds and fighting with a blade barely longer than his forearm. Declan defeated him in 30 seconds. He did not toy with the champion or humiliate him. He closed the distance before the Valanthi could set his stance, deflected the lance with an economy of motion that made it look simple, and put the warrior on the ground with a joint lock that left no permanent damage. Clean, efficient, merciful. The 6th champion lasted longer. A female named Sava Kaur who was genuinely skilled. The fight was beautiful and terrible, the 2 of them moving through a brutal dance that left blood on the stone from both sides. Declan took a gash across his ribs. He kept fighting. He found an opening in her guard when she overextended on a thrust, trapped her arm, and leveraged her to the ground. He could have broken her neck. He held her down until she stopped struggling, then released her and stepped back. 6 champions, 6 defeated, 6 alive. The arena was completely silent. 12,000 Valanthi, who had come to watch a human die, were staring at a human who had beaten their greatest warriors and then refused to kill any of them. The 7th gate opened, and the champion who walked out was Sorath. My brother had inserted himself into the proving. This was not protocol. This was personal. He wanted to kill the human himself and humiliate me in front of the entire court. Sorath was the most dangerous fighter in the royal family. He was fast, vicious, and fought without rules. I saw the poison coating on his secondary blade before anyone else did. I saw the concealed weapon in his offhand. My brother was not here for a fair fight. He was here for a murder. I gripped the arms of my seat and said nothing. There was nothing I could say. The proving was sacred. Interference meant forfeiture of my claim. Sorath attacked without ceremony. He came at Declan with everything. 2 weapons, poison, raw aggression, the fury of a prince who had been publicly upstaged by a lesser species. The arena erupted in violence. Declan was tired. He was wounded. He was bleeding from 3 cuts, and the gash on his ribs had opened wider. Sorath pressed every advantage, and for the first time, Declan was on the defensive, backing up, deflecting, dodging. The poison blade caught his shoulder. I saw the venom hit his bloodstream. His left arm went numb. He shifted his grip, transferred the short blade to his right hand, and kept fighting. Sorath went for the kill, a sweeping overhead strike designed to split Declan from crown to waist. It was a powerful blow. It was also predictable. Declan stepped inside the arc, too close for the blade to connect, and drove his forehead into Sorath's face. The impact staggered the prince. Declan followed through, hooked Sorath's ankle, and put him on his back. The short blade came to rest against Sorath's throat. The court held its breath. My mother leaned forward on her throne. In the upper gallery, Tessivri stood with her hands pressed to her chest. Declan looked up. Through the blood and the sweat and the poison working through his veins, he looked directly at me. I do not know what he saw in my face. I do not know what I was showing him. He dropped the blade. He stepped back from Sorath and stood in the center of the arena, unarmed, bleeding, and unbroken. Then he spoke. His voice carried through the silence, amplified by the acoustics of the dome, heard by every soul in that vast space. He said where he came from, strength was not measured by how many enemies you destroyed. It was measured by how many you did not have to. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words hung in the air like something physical, like a weapon that had been deployed against a target nobody knew existed. I looked at Sorath on the ground, crimson skin flickering with humiliation and rage. I looked at the 6 champions who were still alive because a human had chosen to let them live. I looked at the 12,000 spectators who had come to see a slaughter and instead watched something they had no framework to understand. And I looked at my mother. The Empress rose from her throne. Her face was unreadable. Her golden skin did not flicker. She said the proving was concluded, and the court was dismissed. No judgment, no sentence, no execution order. The Empress simply stood and walked away, and the court dissolved into chaos behind her. I sat in the royal box with my heart hammering against my ribs and watched the guards escort Declan out of the arena. He was barely standing. The poison was spreading. His wounds needed treatment. But he walked out on his own feet, the same way he had walked through my ship. Steady, upright, unafraid. The cracks in the foundation of the Valanthi Dominion had been visible only to me for 3 days. Now 12,000 people had seen them. Now the entire court knew that a single human had defeated 7 of their finest warriors, and then chosen mercy, and the Dominion had no word for what they had witnessed. No precedent, no protocol, no response. My brother would want blood. My mother would want control. The military caste would want answers. And in the upper gallery, 40 Drenai workers were watching the arena lights dim, with something new burning in their eyes. Something that looked, from where I sat, very much like hope. The palace erupted into chaos before the arena lights had fully dimmed. I could hear it in the corridors as I made my way down from the royal box. The hum of 12,000 voices. Not the normal post-proving celebration. Not the cheering and drinking and recounting of kills. But something sharper. Something that sounded like argument, like fracture. Half the military caste was outraged. A human, a creature from a species they considered barely sentient, had humiliated their finest champions. Careers had been destroyed on that arena floor. Reputations built over decades had been dismantled in seconds. Warriors who had spent their entire lives being told they were the apex of galactic combat had just watched a wounded, poisoned human take apart 7 of their best and then refuse to finish the job. The other half was terrified, and that was worse. Because if one human could do this, what happened when they fought 10,000? What happened when the Dominion's border fleets met the full weight of humanity's military? The humans had only been in space for 2 centuries. They were young, primitive, unrefined, and one of them, bleeding and barely standing, had just made Valanthi champions look like children. I pushed through the corridors and went straight to the dungeons. Declan was in bad shape. The poison from Sorath's blade had spread through his left side, deadening the nerves, shutting down muscle function. The gash across his ribs had bled freely during the fights, and the arena floor had not been clean. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow, and when I reached his cell, he was sitting against the wall with his eyes half closed. I had brought medical supplies, a Valanthi field kit, designed for our biology, but the basic principles were the same. Antiseptic, coagulant, antitoxin compounds that might work on human physiology if the dosage was right. The guards at the cell door stared at me as I ordered them to open it. A princess of the Dominion entering a prisoner's cell with medical supplies. This was not protocol. This was not done. I told them to open the cell or find new assignments on a mining station. They opened the cell. I knelt beside Declan and started cleaning the wound on his ribs. He opened his eyes and watched me without speaking. His skin was warm under my fingers. Human skin was strange, soft, no luminescence, no color shifting, no visible display of emotion. Everything they felt was hidden behind those flat, expressive faces. He asked me if tending to prisoners was part of a Valanthi princess's usual routine. I told him to be quiet and let me work. He was quiet for a while, then he said thank you, and the way he said it was so simple and so sincere that it made my hands pause over his wound. I applied the antitoxin to the poison site on his shoulder. He hissed through his teeth but did not flinch. I asked him how he defeated 7 champions. He said he watched them. He said every warrior had patterns, habits, tells. He said the bigger and stronger an opponent was, the more they relied on that strength, and the less they adapted when it failed them. I asked him where he learned to fight like that. He said everywhere. He said humans had been fighting each other for their entire history. He said his species had 10,000 years of warfare to draw from, 100 different combat traditions, 1,000,000 battles studied and cataloged and analyzed. He said humans were not bigger or stronger or faster than most species they encountered. They were just better at learning. He said every defeat taught them something. Every loss was studied, dissected, turned into doctrine. He said humans did not fight the same way twice, because they were always absorbing, always adapting, always evolving their approach based on what had failed before. He said that was what made them dangerous. Not power, adaptation. The antitoxin was working. Some feeling was returning to his left side. He flexed his fingers and winced. Color was returning to his face, and his breathing had steadied. Human physiology was resilient in a way I had not expected. His body was already fighting the poison, pushing back against the foreign compounds, adapting even at the cellular level. I sat back on my heels and looked at him in the dim light of the cell. I asked him a question I had been carrying since the arena. I asked him why he did not kill any of them. 7 opponents, each one trying to kill him, and he had spared every single one. In the proving, mercy was weakness. Mercy was an invitation to be destroyed. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that rearranged the architecture of my thinking. He said killing was easy. Any creature with claws or teeth or a weapon could kill. It took nothing. No skill, no courage, no strength. The real test of a warrior was whether they could win without killing, whether they could end a fight and leave their opponent alive to learn from it. He said a dead enemy taught nothing. A living one could become an ally. I told him the Valanthi did not make allies. We made subjects. He looked at me with those gray eyes and asked me how that was working out. I did not answer, because the answer was bleeding through the walls of my empire in 100 places, and I had only just started seeing it. We talked for a long time in that cell, not as interrogator and prisoner, not as captor and captive, as 2 people sitting in the dark, trying to understand each other. I asked him what kind of empire he thought the Dominion should be. He said that was not his question to answer. He said it was mine. He said he was a soldier, not a politician. But he told me about Earth's history. He told me about empires that had risen on conquest and crumbled when they could not adapt. He told me about nations that had enslaved entire populations and eventually torn themselves apart from the inside. He told me about civilizations that had made the transition from conquest to cooperation and survived. He told me the ones that adapted were still standing. The ones that did not were dust. He told me the Valanthi had the military strength to conquer humanity. Probably. The cost would be catastrophic, but it could likely be done. But even if we won, even if we broke every human fleet and burned every human world, we would inherit a species that would never stop fighting. Humans did not know how to be voiceless. The concept did not exist in their biology. He said his people had a phrase for it. Give me liberty or give me death. He said it was not a slogan. It was a statement of biological fact. He told me about the wars humans had fought against each other, over the right to speak, to think, to choose. He told me about revolutions that had toppled governments 10 times more powerful than the people who rose up against them. He told me about resistance movements that had survived decades of suppression and emerged stronger on the other side. He said every time a ruler tried to silence a human population, the silence became pressure, and pressure always found a way to break free. He said the Valanthi were sitting on 43 sealed containers of that pressure right now. 43 voiceless populations, whose silence was not acceptance but compression. And if the Dominion added humanity to that collection, it would be the spark that lit every fuse at once. I asked him what would happen if the Dominion chose not to conquer humanity. He said then, we might have the chance to build something better than either of our species had managed alone. I left the cell and walked through the palace corridors, and everywhere I went, I could feel the tremors. Officers arguing in low voices, administrators recalculating threat assessments, vassal species delegations whispering to each other with a new energy that looked dangerously close to the hope I had seen in the Drenai's eyes. And then there was HFY. The Drenai elder found me in the corridor outside the throne room. She should not have been able to reach this level. The voiceless were restricted to service corridors and labor areas. But the chaos in the palace had loosened the usual controls. And HFY had walked through the gap with the calm determination of someone who had been waiting 400 years for a door to open. She told me her delegation had arrived. 30 Drenai representatives, drawn from ships and stations across the home fleet, had traveled to the throne world based on the promise I had made. They were here. They were ready to speak. I told her I was working on arranging the audience. She looked at me with those deep, dark eyes and said she knew what working on it meant when a Valanthi said it. It meant waiting. It meant delays. It meant the promise would dissolve like fog under sunlight. I told her I gave her my oath. She said oaths meant nothing when they came from the mouths of those who owned everything. They only meant something when they cost something. I looked at HFY and saw 400 years of patience standing in front of me, and I realized she was right. My oath meant nothing until it cost me something. I arranged the audience. But Sorath moved faster. My brother had been humiliated twice. Once in the arena, put on his back by a creature half his size. Once in the court of public opinion, where the whispers about his defeat were spreading like fire through dry grass. Sorath was many things. Patient was not one of them. I found out about his plan because one of my guards was loyal to me rather than to the throne. She came to my quarters after midnight and told me in a whisper that the prince had dispatched a team. 6 assassins from his personal guard, the Crimson Hand, warriors who operated outside the law and answered only to him. 3 were heading for the dungeons. 3 were heading for the guest quarters where the Drenai delegation had been housed. He was going to kill Declan and the Drenai leaders in one stroke. Clean the board, remove the disruptions. Restore order. I armed myself and ran. The palace of Valanthos Prime was enormous, a labyrinth of corridors and chambers that spanned kilometers. The dungeons were on the opposite side of the complex from the Drenai quarters. I could not reach both in time. I had to choose. I chose the Drenai. There were 30 of them, civilians, unarmed. Declan was a combat veteran. If anyone could survive 3 assassins in a cell, it was him. I reached the Drenai quarters ahead of the assassins and found HFY awake, sitting in the common area with her granddaughter, a small Drenai child named Lyrith, asleep in her lap. She looked up when I burst through the door, armed, skin blazing combat red. I told her to gather her people. I told her we were moving. Now. She did not ask why. 400 years of living under Valanthi rule had given the Drenai an instinct for danger that was faster than any question. She woke the delegation in seconds. 30 Drenai, blinking, confused, afraid, filing out of their rooms while I stood at the door with a weapon in my hand, listening for footsteps. The assassins arrived 90 seconds later. 3 Crimson Hand operatives, moving in a tactical formation, blades drawn, faces covered. They saw me and hesitated. Killing voiceless in their sleep was one thing. Killing a princess of the blood was another. I told them to stand down. I told them I knew who sent them. I told them to return to my brother and inform him that these people were under my protection. One of them told me, very politely, that Prince Sorath's orders superseded mine. He said the prince had declared the Drenai a security threat under wartime authority. He said my personal feelings were noted but irrelevant. I asked him if he wanted to test that authority against my blade. He did. They all did. They had been told the princess had gone soft, contaminated by the human, weakened by sentiment. They expected an easy fight. The fight in the corridor was brief and brutal. I was trained by the same masters who had trained them, and I was angry in a way I had never been angry before. Not the cold, controlled anger of a Valanthi warrior. Something hotter. Something that burned like the look in Declan's eyes when he talked about the pilot who sacrificed herself for 28 children. The first assassin came at me with a double-strike combination that I had been drilling since I was 8 years old. I deflected both blows, stepped inside his guard, and drove my elbow into his temple. He dropped. The second was faster, more careful, but caution was not enough against someone who was not fighting for pride or protocol. I was fighting for something I had never fought for before. I was fighting for people who could not fight for themselves. I disarmed her in 3 exchanges and put her down with a knee strike. I put 2 of them down in under a minute. The third ran. I let him go. I wanted Sorath to get the message personally. The Draenei huddled behind me in the corridor, and Tessavri's granddaughter, Lyrith, was crying. I picked the child up without thinking about it. She was small and warm and trembling, and she wrapped her thin arms around my neck and pressed her face against my shoulder. I had never held a voiceless child before. I had never touched one. The feeling was strange and enormous, and it broke something open inside me that I did not know was sealed. I led the delegation through the service corridors toward the dungeons, moving fast, listening for pursuit. When we reached Declan's level, I heard the sounds of combat before I saw the source. 2 assassins were on the ground outside his cell. Unconscious, disarmed, bleeding, but alive. The cell door was open. Declan was standing in the corridor, with a broken restraint chain wrapped around his right fist, and blood running from a fresh cut above his eye. The third assassin was pinned against the wall, the chain across his throat, Declan's gray eyes inches from his face. He looked up when he saw me. He looked at the Draenei delegation behind me. He looked at Lyrith in my arms. He released the assassin and let the man slide to the floor. I asked him if he was all right. He said he had been in worse situations. I asked him if he had killed any of them. He said no. He said unconscious people answered more questions than dead ones. Lyrith reached out from my arms toward Declan. She was still crying. He took her gently, carefully, adjusting his grip to support her weight, and she tucked her face against his chest. He held her the way someone holds a child they intend to protect, and the blood from his wounds stained her clothing, and he did not seem to notice. Tessavri was watching. Her eyes were wet. She reached out and placed one long-fingered hand on Declan's arm and said something in the old Draenei language, words I did not understand. But the tone was clear. Gratitude so deep it had no bottom. I stood in that corridor with Sorath's assassins on the floor and a human warrior holding an alien child and a 400-year-old elder speaking words in a language that the Dominion had tried to erase, and I made my choice. I had been balancing on the edge since the moment I dragged Declan through the corridors of my warship, since the moment I heard the Draenei's single demand, since the moment I watched a human defeat 7 champions and choose mercy. The edge was gone now. I was on one side, and everything I had been raised to believe was on the other. I contacted my loyal guard commanders through my personal communicator. I used my authority as heir to the throne to issue a priority command. I told them to seal the throne room. I told them to summon the court. I told them that by dawn, this was going to end. The sky above Valanthos Prime was still dark when the court assembled, but the horizon held the first faint traces of color. Dawn on this world was slow, a gradual brightening that turned the crystalline dome from black to deep blue to the blazing gold that gave the Valanthi their sense of eternal superiority. We were the children of the golden sun. We were born to rule. I was about to find out if that was true. I had not called this assembly through force. I had not launched a coup or a military takeover. I had invoked the Right of Ascension challenge, an ancient legal mechanism that allowed the royal heir to formally challenge the sitting ruler's policies before the full court. The right had not been used in over 1,000 years. Most of the court did not even know it existed, but it was still written in the founding codes, still technically law, and my mother was too precise a ruler to deny a legal proceeding. The Empress sat on her throne, golden and immovable. Sorath stood at the base, his crimson skin darkened with fury, a fresh bandage on his jaw, where one of his own assassins had been flung into him during the night's chaos. He had figured out what I was doing when the court summons went out, and he was seething. The court filled slowly. 12,000 Valanthi. Most of them still processing the events of the proving, many of them having heard rumors about the assassination attempt, all of them sensing that something fundamental was shifting beneath their feet. I stood on the central platform with Tesavri beside me and Declan behind me. He was wounded, bandaged, and barely rested, but he stood straight, and his eyes were clear. He had cleaned the blood from his face and hands, and someone had found him a clean shirt, though it did not fit well across his shoulders. I addressed the court. I did not begin with accusations or demands. I began with a question. I asked the assembled Valanthi how many species the Dominion had conquered in its 9,000 years of existence. The answer was 43. Everyone knew this. It was a point of pride. 43 civilizations brought under Valanthi rule, their worlds absorbed, their populations integrated, their cultures catalogued and archived. I asked the court how many of those 43 civilizations still practice their original languages, religions, art forms, or cultural traditions. Silence. I told them the answer was none. 0. 43 civilizations, representing billions of individuals across thousands of years, and every single one of their cultures had been erased. Not destroyed in fire, not burned in battle, dissolved slowly, generation by generation, until the children forgot the songs their grandparents sang, until the languages died in the mouths of the last speakers, until the only evidence that these cultures had ever existed was the trophies lining the corridors of Valanthi warships. I told them this was not integration. It was extinction with a longer timeline. Sorath interrupted. He called my words sedition. He said I had been contaminated by the human prisoner, that I was a disgrace to the bloodline, that I should be stripped of my title and removed from the succession immediately. I let him finish. Then I asked the court to hear from someone who had never been permitted to speak in this chamber. Tesavri stepped forward. She was tall for a Drenai, her frame bent slightly by age, her face mapped with the deep grooves of a long life lived under occupation. She wore the simple gray garment of a voiceless laborer. She had no rank, no title, no formal standing in the Valanthi legal system. She opened her mouth, and 400 years of silence ended. She spoke in perfect Valanthi, because she had been forced to learn the language of her rulers as a child, because the old Drenai tongue was forbidden in public, because the only way to survive in the Dominion was to become invisible in the shape of your conquerors. She told the court what life was like for the voiceless. She told them about the labor shifts that lasted 16 hours in reactor rooms, hot enough to blister skin. She told them about the children who were separated from their parents at age 6 and sent to vocational training camps where they learned to clean and carry and bow. She told them about the names. Drenni names were long, musical, full of meaning, each syllable connected to ancestry, to place, to purpose. The Dominion replaced them with serial numbers. She told them about the old ones, the Drenai elders who remembered life before conquest, who whispered the old stories to their grandchildren in locked rooms at night, who kept the language alive in secret, like a flame cupped between dying hands. She said there were fewer of those elders every year. She told the court about Lirith, her granddaughter, 6 years old, born on a Valanthi warship, raised in the engine room. Lirith had never seen a Drenai world. She did not know the old songs. She could not speak the old language. She did not know her own name meant the one who carries the morning, in a tongue that was dying around her. Tesavri looked at the Empress and said she did not come to beg. She did not come to threaten. She came to say this: we are still here. We remember. And we are tired of being silent. Several members of the court shifted in their seats, administrators who managed voiceless labor forces, officers who oversaw vassal population zones, diplomats who negotiated resource extraction from conquered worlds. They had spent their careers managing the voiceless as logistical units, as numbers on spreadsheets, as components in the machinery of empire. None of them had heard a voiceless speak as a person. I watched a senior administrator in the third tier lower her eyes. I watched a fleet commander in full ceremonial armor grip the arms of his seat until his knuckles went white. I watched a young officer in the military section lean forward with something that looked like recognition on her face, as if she were hearing words she had always known, but never been allowed to think. The discomfort in the chamber was not the discomfort of people who disagreed. It was the discomfort of people who had just been confronted with a truth they had spent their entire lives stepping around. I pressed forward. I presented data that my intelligence officers had compiled at my request during the night. Uprising frequency across the Dominion had increased 300% over the past 50 years. The cost of suppressing voiceless resistance was consuming nearly a fifth of the military's operational budget. Productivity in voiceless labor sectors was declining year over year as cultural erasure replaced motivation with apathy. 3 vassal species were showing early signs of coordinated resistance networks. 2 more had birth rates that had fallen below replacement levels, a slow demographic collapse that would leave entire sectors unmanned within a century. The voiceless were not just unhappy, they were becoming useless, because people who had been stripped of identity and purpose and hope did not work well. And some of them were simply choosing not to continue existing at all. The Dominion was dying, not from external enemies, from the inside. So slowly that no one had noticed, like a building whose foundations were crumbling 1 grain at a time. The structure still looked solid, but one day, it would fall, and by the time it started falling, it would be too late to stop. Sorath interrupted again. He called for my removal. He called for the humans' execution. He called for the Draenei delegation to be returned to their ships and punished for the uprising aboard the Throne of Ashes. The Empress raised one hand. Sorath went silent. My mother had not spoken since the session began, and the court waited for her judgment like a held breath. She looked at me. She asked if I was finished. I said no. I asked the court to hear one more voice. I asked them to hear the human. A ripple of shock went through the assembly. Allowing a prisoner to address the court was unprecedented. Allowing an alien, a member of a species currently engaged in border conflict with the Dominion, to speak from the central platform was unthinkable. My mother studied me for a long moment, then she nodded. Declan stepped forward. He moved slowly, favoring his wounded side, and the bandage on his shoulder showed a spot of fresh blood. He looked up at the dome above, the crystal facets beginning to catch the first real light of dawn, and then he looked at the court. He spoke simply. He did not use grand rhetoric or dramatic gestures. He spoke the way he had spoken to me in his cell, in that corridor, in the dungeon, like a man telling the truth, because the truth was all he had. He said he was a soldier. He said he had fought and bled, and watched people he cared about die. He said he understood war. Humanity had been waging it against itself for 10,000 years, long before they ever reached the stars. He said humans knew conquest. They had done it to each other. They had enslaved their own species. They had committed horrors against their own kind that would make the Valanthi sick. And they had learned from it. Eventually, painfully. Through centuries of bloodshed and revolution and slow, grinding change, they had learned that empires built on domination always fell, always, without exception. Because the thing about keeping someone beneath your boot was that it required you to stand on one leg forever, and eventually, you got tired, and when you fell, the people beneath you had been building strength in the dark for generations. He told them the strongest human nations were not the ones that had conquered the most territory. They were the ones that had turned former enemies into partners. The ones that had found ways to build systems that people chose to be part of, not because they were forced, but because the system gave them something worth protecting. He looked at the Empress and said he knew the Valanthi could probably conquer humanity. He said the cost would be staggering, but the Dominion had the numbers and the firepower to do it. But he said even if they won, even if they burned every human colony and broke every human fleet, they would inherit a problem they could not solve. Because humans did not know how to be voiceless. It was not in their nature. They would fight. They would resist. They would organize and sabotage and rebel. Not for a generation. Not for a century. Forever. Because the thing about humans was that they passed their stories down. Every injustice, every uprising, every act of resistance became a story, and the stories became an identity, and the identity became fuel for the next fight. He said the Valanthi had a choice. They could spend the next 1,000 years fighting a species that would never stop resisting, while their existing voiceless populations crumbled around them, and the cost of maintaining control devoured their resources. Or, they could do something that humans themselves had nearly failed to do. They could choose to be something other than what they had always been. He said he was not a diplomat. He was not a politician. He was a soldier standing in a borrowed shirt with poison still working through his blood, speaking to 12,000 people who could order his execution with a word. He did not have the authority to promise anything, but he could tell them this. If the Dominion reached out its hand instead of its fist, humanity would take it. Not because humans were weak, because humans understood that building something together was harder and braver and more enduring than tearing something apart. He said the strongest thing he had ever seen was not a weapon or a warship or a warrior. The strongest thing he had ever seen was a woman named Grace Holloway, turning her dying fighter into a shield so that 28 children she had never met could live. He said strength was not dominion. Strength was choosing to protect something that could not protect itself. He stepped back from the center of the platform. The court was silent. Not the disciplined silence of a Valanthi assembly observing protocol. A different silence. The silence of 12,000 people who had just heard something they could not dismiss and could not unhear. I watched faces across the chamber. I watched hardened warriors with centuries of combat experience sit perfectly still, processing words that had bypassed their defenses as effectively as any weapon. I watched young officers exchange glances. I watched a Valanthi mother in the civilian section place her hand over her chest, where her heartbeat lived, and I knew she was thinking about her own children. The light was growing in the dome above, the dawn spreading across the crystal facets, turning the chamber from deep blue to pale gold. 12,000 Valanthi sat in their seats and did not move. My mother rose from her throne. The Empress Valith was 327 years old. She had held power longer than most species had existed. She had seen rebellions and invasions and crises that would have shattered lesser rulers. She was not a woman who was moved by speeches or swayed by emotion. She was calculation and power and the cold mathematics of empire. She looked at Declan. She looked at the small, damaged, bleeding creature who had defeated her champions with skill and then defeated her court with words. She looked at Tessivry, standing beside me. She looked at me. She said the Ascension Challenge had been heard. She said the points raised by the heir were noted. She said the court would consider the matter. Sorath erupted. He shouted that this was a farce, that I had committed treason, that the human was an enemy combatant manipulating the court. His voice rang through the chamber, harsh and sharp, and his crimson skin blazed so bright it hurt to look at. Then he drew his blade. He moved toward me across the central platform, weapon raised, face twisted with fury. The guards were too far away. The court was too stunned to react. My brother was fast, and he was committed, and the blade in his hand was the same poisoned weapon he had used in the arena. Declan moved faster. He was between us before I registered the motion. He caught Sorath's weapon arm with his bare hand, twisted it at the joint, and wrenched the blade free. In the same motion, he swept Sorath's legs and put him on the ground for the second time in 12 hours. His knee pressed into Sorath's chest. His hand held the prince's own blade above his throat. The court gasped. And Declan, for the second time, did not kill him. He looked down at Sorath. He said he was not going to hurt him. He said killing a prince on the floor of his own court was the kind of thing empires did, and he was not interested in being an empire. He released Sorath and stood up and placed the blade on the ground and stepped back. I watched 12,000 Valanthi process what they had just seen. A human, wounded and exhausted and poisoned, had saved the life of the princess who had captured him, had disarmed the prince who had tried to kill him, and had chosen mercy a third time. And this time, finally, the court understood what they were seeing. I looked at my mother. Her golden skin had shifted for the first time in my memory. A faint tremor of color moved through it. A ripple of something I had never seen on her face. Not weakness, not defeat, something that looked, impossibly, like recognition. She sat back down on her throne and made her decision. She did not yield the throne. She was too old, too proud, too deeply Valanthi for that. But she did something that no empress had done in the recorded history of the Dominion. She granted the Ascension concession. She acknowledged that the heir's challenge had merit. She authorized me to implement reforms under a formal regency of transformation, a trial period during which the structures of the Dominion could be examined and modified. She ordered the voiceless designation suspended pending review. She ordered the caste system opened for formal evaluation, and she ordered the military campaign against humanity suspended, effective immediately, pending diplomatic contact. The court erupted, not in outrage, not in celebration, in the sound of 9,000 years of certainty cracking open. Voices rose from every tier, questions and protests, and, from scattered corners of the chamber, something that sounded like relief. The sound of people who had been holding their breath for years, finally letting it out. Sorath screamed his protests. He called for the guard. He invoked military authority, ancestral right, divine mandate. But the guards did not move to support him. They had watched the same proving. They had heard the same speech. They had seen the same human choose mercy 3 times, when killing would have been easier and safer and entirely justified. Guards escorted him from the chamber. His crimson skin was fading, the fury draining out of him, replaced by something that looked like the first cold touch of irrelevance. He would not forgive this. He would plot and scheme and wait for his moment. But that moment was not today, and today was all that mattered. Tessavri wept, and 400 years of silence ended in a single dawn. Around her, the Draenei delegation held each other, and one of them began to sing in the old language, softly, the words barely audible above the noise of the court, but present. A song that had survived in whispers and locked rooms, and the stubborn memory of people who refused to forget. The melody was simple, a rising pattern of notes that climbed like light through water, and as it filled the chamber, other Draenei in the upper galleries joined in. Workers and laborers and servants who had kept their songs hidden for generations, singing now because for the first time in 400 years, no one told them to stop. The dawn filled the dome above us. Golden light poured through the crystal facets and flooded the court, and for the first time, I saw the chamber not as a monument to Valanthy supremacy, but as what it could become, a place where 43 voices could speak, a place where strength was measured not by how many you had conquered, but by how many you had chosen to stand beside. I issued my first orders as regent. The Draenei would be given seats on a newly formed advisory council. Their language would be removed from the restricted list. Their children would be given names, real names, names in the old tongue. It was not enough. It was the first step in a journey that would take generations, and there would be resistance and backlash and 1,000 difficult days ahead. But it was a beginning, and beginnings, I was learning, were the hardest part. Everything after was just the courage to keep walking. The court dissolved into a chaos of voices, some arguing, some planning, some simply sitting in stunned silence, as the world they had known rearranged itself around them. I watched officers from the military caste approach Draenei delegates with uncertain expressions, not knowing how to speak to someone they had spent their entire careers treating as equipment. I watched a young Valanthy administrator kneel beside Tessavri and ask her haltingly what the old Draenei word for peace was. Tessavri told her. The administrator repeated it 3 times, committing it to memory, and the sound of a Valanthy tongue forming a Draenei word, for the first time in 4 centuries, was the most extraordinary noise I had ever heard. I found Declan on the balcony outside the throne room, as the sun climbed higher. He was leaning against the railing, looking up at a sky that was not his own, an alien sun-warming skin that had evolved under a different star. The wind moved through his hair, and his wounds were bleeding through his bandages, and he was smiling. I stood beside him and watched the light spread across the crystal towers of the capital city. Below us, the streets were beginning to fill with morning activity. Valanthy citizens going about their routines, not yet aware that the ground beneath their feet had shifted. They would learn soon enough. Some would welcome it. Many would fight it. The change would be messy and painful and imperfect, because that was how real change worked. It was not clean. It was not easy. It was necessary. I told him I seized him as a trophy. I told him I dragged him through my ship, expecting a broken creature I could parade before the court and discard. I told him I expected his species to be another line in the Dominion's conquest ledger, another set of trophies on the wall, another civilization swallowed and forgotten. Instead, I got a mirror. He showed me what my empire looked like from the outside. He showed me the trophies were tombstones. He showed me the silence was not peace. He showed me that the thing I had been calling strength for my entire life was just the loudest form of fear. And once I saw it, I could not unsee it. The sun was fully up now, and the light was gold, and the city stretched out below us in all its crystal brilliance, and somewhere in the corridors beneath our feet, a Draenei elder was singing in a language that had survived 400 years of being forbidden. I did not change my empire because one human was strong. I did not change it because he defeated my champions, or outsmarted my court, or survived my brother's poison. I changed it because one human showed me that real strength was something the Valanthi had never considered. Not power over others, not domination, not the ability to make someone kneel. Real strength was the ability to reach out your hand to someone who had every reason to hate you and say, "Let us build something neither of us could build alone." Declan looked at me, and the alien sun lit his gray eyes, and he said something simple. He said it was a good start. I looked at the sky above Valanthos Prime, the sky that my ancestors had claimed as proof of their divine right to rule, and I saw it clearly for the first time. Not as a crown, not as a symbol of supremacy, as a shared sky, a sky big enough for all of us. The most dangerous thing about humans is not their resilience. It is not their adaptability. It is not their ferocity in battle, or their willingness to die for strangers. The most dangerous thing about humans is that they make you want to be better. And once that wanting takes root, no empire in the galaxy is strong enough to pull it out.